English. Okay, hope he will not be so bad. So how to get back? Okay. And streaming, let's see if they are all there. We cannot see them, no? Let me ask Anna, because Anna, where is Anna? Anna is outside or inside, Elisa? Huh?
Anna just wrote at the shared notes that it's on. You can start.
Okay. It's on. Thank you very much. So we are starting now our first open seminar of our group, Science in Circulation. And our guests today are two professors in Austria, and they are members of the Science in Circulation. They are from social sciences area. And so, first of all, I would like to thank Christian and thank Matthias to be with us, to join us today, to take part of this seminar. Thank you very much. And also Elisa Klüger from Cebrap. I will present them in a minute. And thank you very much, Elisa, to debate, to propose the first debate of this conversation. So, and I would like to thank you all the students and professors who are listening to us, and also some information. It's the first seminar in English. We are in training here. We are trying to do our best to mix Portuguese and English. So the ones who want to prepare questions in English, that will be great. So I will read it already translated. But the ones who cannot, for any reason, write in English, so I will ask you to send us the question in Portuguese, and I will try to translate immediately after. Okay? So thank you very much, and don't be shy. Everybody here is learning. I told Christian and Matthias to make it easy for us, because it's not easy for the ones entering in this world. So I will introduce our both colleagues. Então agora eu vou falar em português. Vamos ter que fazer essa dupla entrada. Agradeço a presença de todas e todos. Espero que vocês consigam interagir com os nossos convidados de hoje, Christian Dayé e Matthias Duller, com o debate da Elisa Klüger. Façam as questões, se for possível, em inglês. Se não for possível, podem fazer em português e a gente vai tentar traduzir por aqui, tá bom? Então, vou apresentar os convidados. Christian Dayé estudou Sociologia e Filosofia na Universidade de Graz e na Universidade de Viena, na Áustria. Ele obteve seu doutorado em 2012, com uma tese sobre a história das ciências sociais durante a Guerra Fria, pela qual recebeu o prêmio Young Scholar, ou Jovem Pesquisador, do GT, História da Sociologia, da International Sociological Association. Ele ingressou na Universidade de Technology de Graz em 2018, onde é membro de um grupo de pesquisa com foco nas inter-relações entre ciência, tecnologia e sociedade. Atualmente está desenvolvendo pesquisas sobre análise comparada entre culturas de predição, por exemplo, narrativas, rituais, práticas e redes estabelecidas para padronizar demandas por conhecimento prognóstico. Obrigada, Christian. Matthias Duller estudou Sociologia e História do Sudeste Europeu na Universidade de Graz, Áustria, também na Universidade de Cluj-Napoca, na Romênia, e na Universidade de Zadar, na Croácia. Ele obteve seu doutorado em Sociologia em 2017, com uma tese sobre Sociologia Histórica Comparada das Ciências Sociais durante a Guerra Fria, incluindo perspectivas de ambos os lados da cortina de ferro. Ele recebeu bolsas de estudo do Centro de Estudos Avançados de Sofia, Bulgária, no Instituto de Estudos Avançados da Universidade da Europa Central de Budapeste, Hungria, e no Instituto de Estudos Avançados em Ciência, Tecnologia e Sociedade de Graz, Áustria. Desde 2020, ele é bolsista da APART, GSK, da Academia Austríaca de Ciências, no Departamento de História da Universidade da Europa Central, em Viena, onde pesquisa relações de intercâmbio acadêmico nas ciências sociais entre a Europa Oriental e os Estados Unidos de 1950 a 1980. Finalmente, apresento Elisa Klüger. Elisa Klüger graduou-se em Relações Internacionais na Universidade de São Paulo. Ela obteve o doutorado em Sociologia na Universidade de São Paulo em 2016, com uma tese sobre o espaço dos economistas no Brasil. Desde 2017, ela é pós-doutoranda no Centro Brasileiro de Análise e Planejamento, Cebrap, tendo sido pesquisadora visitante nas universidades de Picardie, Jules Verne, Berkeley e Princeton. Atualmente, ela prepara um livro baseado em seu pós-doutorado sobre as pós-graduações latino-americanas em Economia e Ciências Sociais que funcionaram no Chile dos anos 1950 aos anos 1970. Então, agradeço a presença novamente de todas e todos vocês e vamos ao debate, vamos às apresentações. So, thank you very much, and Christian, you can start with your speech. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I thank you very much for having us. It's an honor, it's a pleasure to be here. Well, we are all learning, that's very true, Marsha, and we will certainly try not to speak in English that is too close to German, but if we do, just interrupt us, please. Also, let me use this very early occasion to thank Elisa for taking the burden of commenting on our presentations. Let me say a few words on the on our ideas regarding this first or regarding this meeting today. We wanted not so much to present finished research projects, but rather say something about our experiences with using specific research methodologies concerned with the socio-historical analysis of scientific fields and disciplines. So, because basically that is where your projects start when you're doing research in the history of science. You have to decide about how to do your research. But in order to be able to do that, you first have to decide about what you want to research. So what is the object? Where you want to research it? What is the research material? And what is the unit or what is the unit of analysis? And also, to me, always an aspect of methodology. You can reflect on why you want to spend effort researching exactly that in a larger framework. Let me give you an example. For instance, I want to learn how political constellations during the Cold War influenced predictive models of natural scientists. So that would be the what. And I then have to think about where can I research that? What would be a strategic research site? What would be a good unit of analysis where I can find something out about the what? So where should I do that? And one place, just to stay in the example, would be the International Institute of Applied Systems Analysis, an organization which I can perhaps introduce later in very brief. The first organization where researchers from both sides of the Iron Curtain and other places around the globe collaborated actually on predictive modeling. And then I can also reflect on why do I want to do exactly that. Well, I think that it helps better appreciate the contribution that history of science can make to current science. That might be a reason. Or another answer for this large why question would be that I think, well, if we know something about these influences, how these influences shape political or social or cultural influences shaped the predictive models, then I am better able to, well, evaluate the predictions also in the present. These are examples for larger answers to the why question, which, to repeat that, I think is always important when you're constructing, when you're designing a research project. Let me focus on the units, because this is what we are going to concentrate on. So where do we want to research our object? And basically, there, together with a senior colleague of mine, the PhD supervisor of both Matthias and myself, we once came up with a 5-fold scheme. So you can focus on or concentrate 5 units of analysis, and actually this is what writings in the history of the sciences usually do. So they can focus on actors. Very famous is, of course, the biography, right? So an individual scholar who is the unit of analysis. But you also find a lot of research on groups or schools, on generations and cohorts. The second unit that you can focus on are ideas, also very popular, of course. So you can write the history of concepts or the history of theories across various proponents or actors. You can, third, focus on instruments. Then you would write the history of methodologies, the history of methods, the history of techniques and research practices. Fourth, focus on institutions or organizations, and write, for instance, something about the history of International Institute of Applied Systems Analysis, or the history of the Institute for Advanced Studies in the Social and Behavioral Sciences, or whatever. Or you focus on contexts, and you are analyzing, you are exploring your object with a focus on the embeddedness of science or social science in larger social, political, and so forth environments. Of course, none of this is mutually exclusive. It's not that you're doing either or you're forced to doing either or. You can find combinations, but these are the units. And so now our motivation here was, since throughout the decades, the dominant units of analysis have been actors and ideas, to present some, well, approaches, alternatives that might be inspirational, provide inspiration for taking other units of analysis into view. So we will present methodologies that allow you to focus on the history of instruments as units of analysis, on the history of institutions, and on, well, contextual factors. And the first one, the first methodology that I will present is co-citation analysis. You will have seen the slides. I will, if time allows, describe how it helps to explore the history of instruments or the history of institutions. And Matthias will then describe qualitative comparative analysis as a means, as a method to bring into view the context, the social embeddedness of science. Well, that's more or less what I said already. So I think we can, this would have been the introduction. And I now switch to the presentation on co-citation analysis. This leaves me some time. Do you have questions so far, or shall I just continue?
It's okay, Christian, you can continue. Thank you.
I will do so. Okay, co-citation analysis. I like co-citation analysis because it is a, if you've done that once, if you've done that once, it allows you very quickly to come to some form of well, quick and dirty picture about how a specific scientific field might be structured. Okay, so it's an exploratory method which I want to present, and which ideally you can then after this course go to your own, try yourself on your own computer. So I will talk about principles and procedures of co-citation analysis, and then if time's do at least one exemplary analysis. I'm not sure whether I will be able to do the second one. Basically, co-citation analysis is an application of mathematical operations that have been developed in social network analysis. The source, so the data material, is written text, and co-citation analysis has been developed in scientometrics, so in the science of, or in the measurement of science, of which we are surrounded nowadays, but which in the 1960s, 1970s was a rather, well, pioneering endeavor. Nowadays we meet citation indices everywhere basically, and orient ourselves onto stuff like Hirsch's index and so on and so forth. At the moment, the co-citation analysis is also increasingly used not only with regard to scientific literature, but also with regard to content posted on various social networks. So basically, co-citation analysis asks which two sources are cited together in the available data. This is to differentiate from biographical coupling, and I have a series of slides to make the difference clear. Imagine, as I said, that you have a data set which contains bibliographic information of scientific articles. So the title, author, abstract, institution on which the authors are working, and so on and so forth. This data set also includes the references of each of the entries. So not only the title, but also the sources that have been cited in the article. You can retrieve such data from scientific databases, for instance, the Web of Science, in case you have access to that. So you have a series of articles which are described in this bibliographic data set. Now, since you also have the literature references of each article, in addition to all these articles, you also have information on the sources that they cite. So you can, at this point, so with this data, you can ask two questions. The first is bibliographic coupling. The question is, which elements of the available data, which articles, cite the same two sources? For instance, in this case, you see that article 1 and 2 both cite source number 3 and source number 6, if I'm not mistaken. Now, if you're doing co-citation analysis, then you focus not on the articles in your data set, but rather on the sources that they cite. So the question is, which two sources are cited together in the available data? In this case, so what enters your analysis is not article 1 and article 2, but source 3 and source 6. This is important for various reasons, but I should point out two, especially if you're working with an historical interest, right? And we know that, well, the large databases increasingly gained in quality over time and in coverage, of course. So if you're interested in the past, the use of databases come with a certain limitation. So what happens when you're focusing on the sources is that the sources can themselves be published quite earlier than the article, right? Even if you have a limitation in the articles, if you only have a database that covers publications after 1919, then you still, if you are focusing on the sources, have sources that have been published before. Second aspect of why I think co-citation analysis is better suited for historical analysis is that, or historical analysis of scientific communities, of referencing clusters. I mean, you're more interested in getting to know what were, in fact, the influential, how should I put, positions in a specific literature. And that is what you find out when you're doing a co-citation analysis. The procedure is basically the same with all quantitative research. You generate a data set, you apply some mathematical operations. I'm going to be very quick on that. I don't want to go into detail at all. The slides are full. If you can read it at home if you have access to the slides. It's not that important unless you are really interested in becoming an expert in co-citation analysis. So what you, and afterwards, third step is, of course, the interpretation of what you find. I'll browse quickly over that. As I said, there are 3 steps involved. You do a normalization of frequencies of the frequencies of co-occurrence in order to make that comparable. Then you have a mapping procedure. As I said, co-citation analysis uses operations from social network analysis, and social network analysis always basically has this step of mapping something into a 2-dimensional or sometimes a 3-dimensional space. And this is also what happens here with co-citation analysis. And really, you have some clustering, not mechanisms, but operations. There are several available of these clustering mechanisms. What you have at the end is is a list of clusters show you which sources have been very often cited together. Huh? Okay, that were the principles in a very quick and dirty way. Now I want to show what you can get from doing a co-citation analysis. I focus here on the history of a specific research method, the Delphi technique or Delphi method, which is well, it has been developed in the 1950s as a method to predict mainly technological and social change. I generated my data set via a search in the Web of Science, which is, well, one of these large international databases that of scientific literature that has a rather good coverage on of the social sciences. You have to do some tricks, of course, when you are doing research on Delphi, because you don't want to learn something about the place in Greece, but really on the method. So I used a longer query, Delphi study or Delphi technique or Delphi procedure, and so on and so forth. This search resulted in over 5,800 titles, of which I then exported the a data set, and you see here one first limitation, of course. Web of Science restricts the amount of well, at least in my case, there might be other versions of that, but in my case, and I've tried it, and I've discussed it with colleagues, so they had the same result. So the size of the number of the titles that you can export is restricted to 500, which is not that problematic. If you are, as I said at the onset, aware of that what you're doing is an exploratory research. It's not, I mean, you're not really measuring. You're trying to get a first view on how a specific field or literature is structured. You export the full record plus the cited references. That is, of course, important because, as I said, co-citation analysis is interested on the sources cited. So here you see an example of such an entry. So you've got 500 of them. You see the authors. Oh, sorry, I should point here. The authors, the title, the journal, the language, the abstract, and then here with CR, you have the cited references. Okay, and that is what a co-citation analysis takes as the data material. I usually then use, if I'm really doing this with an exploratory interest, I'm using VOS Viewer, which is a free open access software. You just type into your internet browser the name of the software, VOS Viewer, and you can download it on your computer, and then I might show this later on, perhaps a bit hands-on, but I'm running out of time. If you have the slides, however, you can do this quite easily on your own. Because these are, as you see here, these are the text that is written on the windows of the software. And basically what you end up with is something like that. A network of cited literature. It is colored in this case. So the clustering operation resulted or returned 2 clusters, one in red, one in green. I won't go that much into detail. So, but what you then do is you see here the cited sources, which are clustered, and you then try to interpret, okay, what the clusters mean. So, what do they really? Do the red ones really make for a sensible unit or cluster? Not just mathematically, but also on the level of content. And if you do that repeatedly and compare different literatures or different search terms, you get an eye for what is interesting here. For instance, is that while there are 2 clusters, they aren't really separated. So they have strong interrelations. There's a considerable overlap between the clusters. With the same data set, you see here step 4, VOS viewer suggests a minimum number of citations. This has been, so the suggested number when you're doing the analysis in VOS viewer has been 20 in this case. This is adapted to what the software finds in the data. If you reduce this minimum number here, you see, to 10, then the picture is a bit different. You have 4 clusters, but still the same picture, that they are really strongly interrelated. But what you can then do, so if you're really interested in the history of this specific method, what you're then supposed to do is, well, first try to make sense of these. What are these clusters? What do they mean? What is their substance? Are they really different from each other in terms of focus, for instance? And indeed they are. I mean, cluster 1 is then nursing, public health, and there are 2 clusters on technological forecasting, and then 1 on decision theory or marketing. And then the next step would be to look into these clusters and, for instance, try to find out whether they have different standards of using this technique, have different, do use this technique with different research interests, for instance, right? And this is truly the case. The use of Delphi in this case in nursing and public health is not about forecasting at all. It's about establishing standards, establishing a consensus about standards in nursing, in public health, and so on and so forth. If I may take another 6 to 7 minutes, then I could try to do that really hands-on. With my second case, the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, located in a nice castle in Luxembourg, close to Vienna, founded in 1972. As I said already, the first institute where really researchers from sides of the Iron Curtain came together and well, some of them really collaborated, others allegedly were spies, but some of them really collaborated, and it exists until today. Interdisciplinary research on global issues ranging from acid rain to river management, urban development, population growth, and so on and so forth. And a strong methodological direction or orientation or tradition, that's perhaps the better term, in modeling and simulation. So my idea was, it was not that successful, but at least a bit. You can also, you cannot only search for key terms or authors, you can also search for affiliations in the end. So what I hoped to get was all the articles cited in web or all the articles documented in Web of Science where people were authors who gave as their affiliation the IIASA or the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis. And I said I tried, and it wasn't that successful. I should think, so at the moment I'm at the point in time where I think I'm trying to figure out why I wasn't that successful, but I mean, I only have 210 results, which I would now try to show how use for a co-citation analysis hands-on. So this is VOS Viewer. It might be a bit small. I'm afraid of that. But here you have a create button. Sorry, I have to put that there. Then you are asked to, well, what kind of map do you want to create? In our case, so VOS Viewer offers a lot of options for various kind of data, including network data, but in our case, we want to create a map based on bibliographic data. We can use data from different data sources, including citation programs like EndNote or RefWorks, and so on and so forth. Download data through API. Not going into details here, but here you see read data from bibliographic database files, including Web of Science. This is what we want. Then so this will take a second. I have to look for the data. I'm not showing you my computer, but you can trust me. I will be ready in a second. The data are usually stored as a text file. The next question is, what type of analysis do you want to make? We want to make a co-citation analysis. The unit of analysis are the cited references. That's what we want to have, and we will apply full counting. Here you see. You might remember when I was presenting the Delphi case, we had a minimum number of citation of 20, and I reduced it then to 10. Here, the suggested number is 4, so this it's quite small, right? In comparison to the other data set, but in this case, we have also a series of clusters. The cluster list is here if you're on the second folder here. Just some quick remarks. You immediately see it's a smaller data set. You still have a considerable number of clusters. And these clusters appear at least to be more distant from each other than in the first case on the Delphi. So what again I would have to do, or I will have to do, is to find out whether this in fact corresponds to sensible, substantive academic tribes, or whether this is just these are just mathematical clusters that I cannot really make sense of. Okay. Let me come to a quick conclusion. Where am I? So, of course, this has limitations. Limitation related with the database. Coverage, of course, still has a dominant focus on English publications. This is, of course, problematic. You can, especially with an historical interest. I mean, nowadays, if you are publishing in German, and it might be similar in Portuguese, some journals require you to provide an English title and an English abstract, so they still enter the Web of Science, although the main text is in German. But this is rather new and not so, doesn't lend itself naturally to historical analysis. Another problem, of course, especially when you're, as I am, dealing with social science close to policy and close to decision making, is that you have a focus on published text. This might be sufficient, this might be good, but in my case, this is a bit of a problem. Might be a bit of a problem if you're taking it too serious. Also, you have a science to science focus here. Science to public is not systematically covered. And you depend on the exactness of the entries, and you depend, if you have, for instance, an error or a cited article comes in two different versions, then it's not identified as the same article. So with these problems, you have to count, you have to calculate, so to speak. But still, I hold that it is a very useful method of exploration. It can be a starting point for further, deeper, content focused, qualitative, literary, whatever analysis, and thus a valuable first step in identifying knowledge collectives in the sciences. And with that, I think I'm done. My part. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Christian. It's not so difficult to understand. Afterwards, we talk about. So, Matthias, yes. So, Matthias, now it's your turn. Thank you very much.
Yeah, hello. Also, thanks very much, Marcia, from me, for inviting us here and for having the chance to present some of my work that I've done in the last couple of years. So what I'm going to present is an article that is basically finished, not yet published, but it will be published in the summer, I hope. And this one initially began as an exercise in the method of qualitative comparative analysis, or QCA, but then slowly developed into a more substantial article on the history of sociology in post-war Europe. So while this, I think in the article it's visible that I couldn't quite decide if I write more a methodological piece or a substantial piece. I will concentrate here today a little bit more on the method. I try not to be overly technical. It does get technical at some point, but if I ever be too fast or unintelligible, please just interrupt me if it's not to be followed. Okay. So, how do I go to the next slide? Okay, here we go. So the starting point of this article is the question of the possibility of a comparative historiography in the social sciences and sociology, in this case in particular, which is not very common. The majority of works, what Christian also mentioned, is not comparative, focuses on single figures, it focuses on single schools or disciplines or countries. But there are a number of works also that try to take comparative approaches seriously. And one of the things that have been done, for example, are data-driven comparisons. An example here is a project that is called InterCo-SSS, which tried to collect various data on indicators of institutionalization, for example, the relative size of disciplines over time series data, how do they develop, in country comparisons, also in discipline comparisons, and then from this data-based comparisons try to make any connection to historical development. So this is one not very common but existing approach to comparative historiography in the social sciences. And on the other end of the spectrum, there are so-called small n designs that take 2 or 3 historical cases and analyze them in great depth. And here I think one of the outstanding examples would be Marion Fourcade, a work on economists and societies, who tries to give a picture of the historical development of economics in 3 countries over 100 years and goes in great depths. So these 2 quite different poles of comparisons exist, and what I want to present here is one more alternative to these approaches that lies somewhere in between, and that is what is called the medium n comparison. That means in this case 20-odd cases, or it can be 12 cases or something like that. And for these situations, one of the methods that can be used is QCA, and this obviously lying in between combines some of the strengths and of course also weaknesses of the qualitative in-depth analysis and quantitative strategies that are more based on real data-based observations. Sorry, I'm having an issue with switching. It happened before, it doesn't happen now.
Hi, Matthias.
Do you know how do I switch to the next slide?
I don't know, maybe Lisa can help us. Well, it's
I'm
just enter. I
this.
think it's just, yeah, here you are.
I think I cannot switch if somebody else does it.
No, it's done, it's done.
No, it's done, okay.
Yeah,
so
well, I see, sorry, but I see errors on my screen here, so I somehow can change the slides.
I think I'm not a presenter.
I'm seeing the qualitative comparative analysis.
Yeah. Okay.
That's it, based on qualitative case studies. Is that right, Christian? You were seeing that also?
Yeah, I see that.
Okay.
But now I lost the arrows to change the slide, so this must be somebody else who can.
I have become the presenter now. This was the problem. Okay, sorry for that. Okay, so here just a few principles of what Qca is. So Qca is really based on qualitative case studies. This is essentially a qualitative method. It is very important to have detailed knowledge of these case studies as a starting point, but then, and this is what it's all about, then it abstracts from these case studies and formalizes them in two ways. First, it divides cases into those that exhibit a certain outcome that we are trying to explain. So some cases have a certain outcome, some do not. This is the starting point of any QCA. And second, then it searches for a set of historical conditions or of causal conditions that are in principle thought of being causally relevant to explaining why some cases exhibit the outcome and the others do not. That is the basic logic. So we do abstract from these cases by understanding them as configurations of conditions. Some cases have certain conditions and others do not, and this is the form of formalization that we do. This is, of course, a kind of causal analysis, but it is a type of causality that is being called complex causality. Again, trying to do justice to what qualitative researchers usually understand as causal analysis. And only three principles here. One, equifinality. This means that usually in social science situations, a specific outcome can be explained by more than one explanations. The road can get wet through rain, or it can get wet through washing. It is not finding a causal explanation for an outcome in this understanding is not one exclusive explanation. There can be many. We are only trying to find some of them. And the second is called multifinality. This means that a condition can have different effects dependent on the context. Again, this is trying to do justice to complex historical situations. And the principle of asymmetry, that means that to understand why something happens is not necessarily the same as understanding why something does not happen. So we have to do different analysis for explaining certain phenomena in the social world than for explaining the absence of that phenomenon. Here we go. And this is a little bit more technically an illustration of two kinds of causal relations that QCA always searches. These are set theoretic relations, and they are necessary and sufficient conditions. Now you see here, I don't know if you can read, that is a little bit small. So the upper figure is an illustration of what a necessary condition is. You have here the outer circle, which is the set of cases that share a specific condition. For example, countries that have access to the sea. And you have the inner circle that are the set of cases that have a certain outcome. For example, being a great seafaring nation in the early modern period, right? So this relation would mean that having access to the sea is a necessary condition for being a seafaring nation. There are no countries that are great seafaring nations in the early modern period that do not have access to the sea. There are countries that have access to the sea who do not, who did not become seafaring nation. That is a necessary condition. And technically speaking, we can say being a seafaring nation is a subset of being a country with access to the sea, right? This is the set theoretic foundation of these kind of statements. And in the lower box, we have a reverse situation, and this is called the sufficient condition. Here, the outer circle sees the set of cases that have a certain outcome, and the inner circle is the set of a certain causal condition. So, for example, let the outcome be people wearing dirty clothes, and the condition be to spill mustard on your shirt. It is sufficient if you spill mustard on your shirt to have dirty clothes, but you can also have played in the mud before and have, for different reasons, dirty clothes. So these are the two in very principle kind of relations that we search with set theoretic methods and QCA in particular. Okay, that is all for the logical introduction. And now to the more substantial part of the article. So what I'm trying to explain here is in the situation after the Second World War in Europe, which countries developed full institutionalization of sociology within a relatively short period of time, and which did not, which did have any some inhibitions in that process. And what you see here in this chart is here on the upper side a timeline that goes here from here is 1945, here is 1968 until 2006. That was the last time. And you see which country, these are all European countries, 25 in the post-war period, minus microstates such as Andorra and the like. And you see in which year, which country has institutionalized, has founded with a specialized sociological association in a year. J stands for a specialized sociological journal, and C stands for a sociological curriculum at the master level. Together, if they are all present, this would be an indicator for a fully institutionalized sociological discipline. And if they are not here, then there is some inhibitions. And what we see empirically, that the 25 countries roughly fall into two groups. And one here in the upper box is a set of countries in which this process happens relatively quickly after 1945 and is finished somewhere by this is the threshold of 1968 approximately. So within roughly 20 years, all institutional achievements are here. And in the lower box, we see that these processes take very long. They are inhibited from various reasons, very often political resistances or the like. There are different explanations for that. And the goal in this article is to find historical conditions that can explain why a country is part of the upper group or part of the lower group, why some countries have full and quick institutionalization of sociology in post-war Europe, and why there are inhibited processes of institutionalization. Then, according to the logic of QCA, we have to define a number of causal conditions that we believe are causally related in one way or the other to explaining these differences. So the first thing that I looked at was something that is called continuity of a pre-war tradition. This has been very obviously of relevance in several countries, like in Germany. You had full institutionalized sociology in the interwar period. There were already chairs, departments, curricula, and associations, and it was quite easy and quick to reestablish them right after the war, and already in the later 1940s. It is basically reestablished, and that is an important condition for the success of sociology afterwards. Obviously, Poland is another case from the Eastern Bloc that has had a very well-established sociology before, and could continue later on after a while to revive these traditions. Austria is a case that is not part of that set. Because here very large parts of social science establishment have emigrated, and there was no real continuation of that tradition. There was a tradition, but it has not been continued. And the same is true for Eastern Germany, for example, where, of course, due to the very repressive communist regime, no continuation of earlier traditions was possible. The second condition I'm looking at is liberal democracy. That is, of course, one of the most cited historical conditions in the literature for the success of social sciences that is quite well established. For example, Portugal is a case where this has been very directly opposed by the Salazar regime, but of course also many of the East European countries have had problems in institutionalizing social sciences, so that I think is quite obvious. Then the third condition is what I call a distinct phase of post-Stalinist revisionism, or in short, thaw. And this is being used because we have at least 3 countries in the Eastern Bloc, non-democratic countries, socialist regimes, Yugoslavia, Poland, and a little bit later also Czechoslovakia, who institutionalized very quickly and fully sociology at one point. Yugoslavia a bit earlier in the 50s and around 1960. Poland very quickly after the 1956 liberation, and the Czechoslovakia also during the mid-1960s. And in each case, these were phases of very radical openings of political liberties, also reorientation away from the Soviet Union towards the West. And always in these cases, we see rather sudden openings for sociological institutions that also had long-lasting effects in these countries. Hungary is here an interesting case where this revolution happened too early. So this is not part of this set. Further on, I was then looking for other conditions that can explain why several of the democratic countries had these very inhibited processes of institutionalization. And one of the conditions that reappeared sometimes in the readings on national histories was that large neighboring countries sharing the same language can have inhibiting effects to institutionalizing social sciences. So examples are Austria with Germany, Switzerland in 3 directions actually, with the German-speaking area, the French-speaking area, and the Italian-speaking area. Belgium also is one of them. And the idea here is that if it is possible against certain resistances to have access to neighboring labor markets, universities, and the like, the pressure is smaller to establish their own institutional environments, if such a thing exists. Scandinavia is an interesting case here to compare, because here rather the opposite happened, that linguistic proximity endorsed cooperation, and probably was a factor that actually helped institutionalizing sociology. But the idea is here that it's not one large dominating partner, but countries of similar size who could have actually the opposite effect on each other. And finally, the 5th condition that I'm discussing is political Catholicism, and this is quite interesting because it appeared that many of the democracies that have been inhibited in their sociological institutionalization have very strong influences of the Catholic Church. Ireland is here a very good example where not only this is the case, but there was also rather early something that very specifically Catholic sociology. So there were chairs held by Catholic priests who founded their research really on papal encyclicas, and they were priests very often, and they really occupied positions, institutions at universities as Catholic sociologists. And then of course you have a process that takes a few generation at least to replace them by what they call then secular sociology. Austria is a case where this is a little bit more hidden, but also you have a Catholic-dominated party that controlled large parts of educational policies after the Second World War, that had no real interest in sociology, and said we have our own Catholic social doxa, and we don't need that. So this appears to be an important factor in explaining why democracies did not develop sociology. Now, what we see is that all of these conditions do explain parts of the story, but none of them really accounts for all the differences. So in the next step, we would then try to see how do these conditions, absent or present, combine, and how are they related to different outcomes. This I skip. Okay, and this here now is the first important empirical piece of evidence. So what I do is for each country, each of these 25 countries, I assign for each of the conditions whether or not it is a part of the set or not. So Albania, to take the first line, does not have a continuity of a pre-war tradition. That's why it's 0. It is not a liberal democracy during the time. It does not have a strong phase of post-Stalinist revisionism thought. It does not have the larger neighbor with the same language. It does not have a strong influence of the Catholic Church. And it is a member of, it is not a member of the outcome set, that is, it is not a member of the successful institutionalizing countries, but one of the inhibited, right? So each of these lines does that. Austria has no continuity. It is a democracy. It has no thought by necessity. It does have the large neighbor. It also does have political Catholicism, and it is a member of the inhibited institutionalization processes, and so forth. Germany, maybe West Germany here, it does have the continuity of a pre-war tradition. It is a democracy. It has no neighbor. It has no very strong Catholic influence, and it is a member of the positive outcome set. That is, it is a member of the successful institutionalizers of sociology, and so on. So you have then 150 decisions to make, and then we can further see what we can learn from these. And then the next part is the one that is in the paper, I assume, a little bit hard to read, but I try to reduce the technicalities here to the minimum. The first thing then what we do is to ask, and this is done with the help of a computer program, which of the conditions, or in some cases also combination thereof, fulfill the logical requirements of necessary and sufficient condition. And we begin by necessary conditions for the positive outcome. We do this always twice. So we take the countries that have successful institutionalization and ask, is there anything that is necessary of these conditions to have successful institutionalization? And what we see in principle, we should here concentrate on single conditions, except when we find so-called unions, that is like the last line here, that point to a concept of higher order, that are some kind of functional equivalent. And we have here 3 measures. Consistency is the most important. That means if this is one, there are no cases that contradict logically the formulation of necessary conditions. And then they also have to be relevant. There must be enough cases of that, and they have to cover enough space of these conditions. So I will not go into the details, but we need to ask these three questions if we want to interpret them really as necessary conditions, because this is a rather strong assumption that we want to be sure. And there's only one condition that fulfills these requirements, and this is countries must have either liberal democracy or a post-Stalinist revisionist phase, a very strong one. One of the two must be present to have a successful institutionalization, otherwise it does never happen. And this, of course, suggests there is some kind of minimal degree of political liberties that is necessary for sociology to take roots during the post-war period. Can be granted by democracies, or by liberalizing socialist regimes. But a minimum degree must be there. We then perform the same for the negated outcome, that is for the set of countries that are inhibited. And here, none of the conditions that we find fulfills all of these requirements. So we cannot define from this data any necessary conditions for explaining inhibited processes of sociology. So we have to then resort to explanation by sufficiency. And this here is the basic tool for any sufficiency analysis in QCA, which is called the so-called truth table. It functions a little bit differently from before. What you see, each row now is one possible combination of these 5 causal conditions. And then we see, is one combination of them related to the positive outcome or to the negative outcome? So, for example, the first row, so we can read this as a sort of empirical typology, if you will, right? Or it's also called in the literature a causal pathway, one of the possible ways how to achieve a certain outcome. So the first row are countries that do not have the continuity of an earlier tradition, that are democracies. They cannot have a thaw by that very reason. They do not have a strong neighboring country, and they do not have a strong influence of the Catholic Church. This kind of combination or configuration is related to the positive outcome. It is related to successful institutionalizations, and we see this inclusion score of 1 means there are no cases contradicting that, and we see these are the Scandinavian countries, basically: Denmark, Finland, Norway, and Sweden. The second line means it differs from the first in that it does have the continuity. So earlier traditions were strong and revived after the war. And these are again 4 cases, and this is West Germany, France, Netherlands, and Great Britain, UK. The third line would then be Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia. They are different from the earlier. They are no democracies, but they do have the strong revisionist phase. No Catholics, no neighbors. And Poland is a category of its own. So in principle, these first 4 lines here that are related with outcome 1, these are 4 different explanations of why countries developed successful institutionalization. The lines 5 to 11, they are all related to the outcome 0. These are then 6 different explanations of why it does not happen. Again, we don't have to go through all of them. The first is the most frequent. They have no continuity, which would help. They have no democracy, which would help. They have no thaw, no neighbors, and no Catholics, and they are not part of it. Here we have some that differ only in that they have Catholicism, which is a negative effect in addition. And we have here some of the democracies that do not have sociology, either way, because they have both neighbors and Catholics, or one of the two, and of course non-democracies and the like. So the first 11 lines are then so-called something of a typology of what happens, what we see in the data. And these lines 12 to 32, these are so-called logical remainders. These combinations of conditions are possible in principle, but they did not happen empirically. There are no cases that fall into either of these categories. There's not much to say at this point about them, only that some of these can be illogical. And this is especially here where it says untenable. A configuration that has liberal democracy and post-Stalinist thaw doesn't make sense, right? Because post-Stalinist thaw only refers to non-democracies. So some of them are meaningless, and that's why we would expect they don't happen. Others just don't happen. This is what the social reality always gives us. Okay. Then I think some of the signs are not properly shown here. Anyway, in the next step, this is still quite complicated. What we saw in the truth table, we have certain beginning points that we see, but it's very hard to interpret still because it's too many different combinations. So what we can do is to logically minimize these conditions, these solution terms, I'm sorry. And the principle is quite easy. If we have two cases that, so here is uppercase means the presence of a condition, lowercase means the absence of a condition. If we have two cases, the absence of A, B, and C leading to the outcome, and we have another case where A is absent, but B and C leads to the outcome, we can assume that B and C are relevant and A is causally irrelevant. That is the basic operation, and then the computer does many more things. The goal is to have shorter and more powerful explanations that are easier to interpret. And then there are different ways to do this. I will really not go into that part because it's tiresome. But the question is, the more of these logical remainders we include into the minimizations that do not exist empirically, the higher the chances is to shorten the expression. So if we use all of them, we arrive what we call the most parsimonious solution. That is the shortest possible expression of the data that does not contradict the evidence. So that is the most parsimonious, some would say the most elegant solution term or theory that we can arrive. And then here we see that there are basically two ways that sociology successfully institutionalizes after 45. Either you have only one thing, that is the post-Stalinist revisionism. This directly is sufficient in this reading for having sociology, and we have the three cases: Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and Poland. Or the second pathway would be we have liberal democracies, but in the same time, no neighboring country with the same language and no strong Catholic influence. Again, lowercase letters, absence of condition, uppercase letters, presence of condition. So these are the two ways in this very short way of explaining the outcome, the positive outcome, successful institutionalization. Now there is a problem, and these are which of the simplifying assumptions are used. Some of the assumptions that went into this model are illogical, right? For example, the ones that have both the democracies and revisionism. So there is another solution term that is usually the preferred solution term, which is a bit longer, and that is called enhanced intermediate solution. So this would be, let's say, the theory that we would then try to interpret at one level. And what we see, we have either here democracy and no thought, or we have no democracy and thought. So this is implied in the idea that it's necessary to have one of the two. But both solution terms say you must not have a neighboring country of the same language, and you must not have Catholicism. So that is from the sufficiency analysis, the outcome of all these calculations. In addition to being interesting that neighboring countries and Catholicism really pose a problem apparently for sociology, we can also see that the condition continuity disappeared. So that means it suggests there is no causal relation attached to the continuity of a pre-war tradition for the success of sociology after 1945. It means really the political conditions in post-war are decisive, not so much as what happened earlier. We then do the same kind of analysis for explaining the inhibited cases, meaning here outcome is 0. Here again, in the shortest possible way of expression, we see three very short terms. One is to have the larger neighboring country directly sufficient for not having sociology: Switzerland, Austria, Ireland, Belgium. The second is Catholicism, again, for itself being sufficient for for having an inhibited process of sociology. Is also Portugal and Spain part of it, Austria, Ireland, Italy, and Belgium. And then the simultaneous absence of both liberal democracy and this revisionist phase, if none of them is present, then we also have inhibited processes, and these are Albania, Bulgaria, East Germany, Greece, Hungary, Soviet Union, Portugal, Spain, and Romania. And once again, the actually preferred solution term is a little bit more complicated. And here, when we look at the second and the third terms, I think that's the only thing that is really interesting here to add, is that this condition of continuity reappears. And now we can also see one of the problems that we've had before, because as it happens, many countries that do have larger neighboring countries also intersect with the Catholicism condition. And in such theoretic methods, if we have large intersections of the same conditions, we cannot really know which one is the one responsible in a specific case. But here we see something interesting, that the countries that have large neighboring countries have no continuity attached, and the countries that are here with Catholicism do have continuity. And this points to the fact, exactly as I explained for Ireland before already, that under the condition of continuity of pre-war traditions and a very strong Catholic influence, very often you have a conservative social science establishment sitting in universities, and this poses a problem in the changed situations after the Second World War, where the dominant strand in sociology is clearly secular and non-Catholic. So here these combinatorial effects are best visible in this data. Then finally, how to interpret all of this. Of course, the solution terms themselves must be assessed. Do they pose plausible explanations for each cases that we have read? Is there something really to learn from? I think this continuity is one of the interesting things. But more importantly and more interestingly, I think you should always go back to the cases afterwards. Did we learn something that makes single case studies appear in different light? And this is, I think, the more interesting result very often in QCA research than the very solution terms themselves. And here are only two examples. One is one of the more surprising results here concerns this continuity condition. I already said it, and it appears that continuity of a pre-war tradition under the simultaneous condition of a regime change, that leads to certain problems. One is already said it with Catholicism. You have institutionalized Catholic sociology, and then a sort of conflict over existing institutions and the resistance against secular sociology and the like. And the second one, which is a hypothesis that I'm working on now, is for the socialist countries, we can see if there is a continuity of a strong pre-war condition, this leads to antagonisms between the new socialist regimes and the social science communities. And very often, and I think this is something I will try to show in a future paper, this leads to strong dissident inclinations, actually, because there is a fight of the new regimes with the old intellectual elites, and by the time there is a growing resentment, and by the 1970s and 80s, those countries in the socialist bloc that had strong traditions earlier developed much more stronger dissident inclinations than those countries who had no such traditions, and the existing intelligentsia was actually benefiting from the institutional opening during that time. So that is one of the lessons. The second lesson here is if we stay with this idea that liberal democracy or Thaw are functional equivalents, then these two lines actually would compare quite well. And these are the Scandinavian countries and some of the more liberal socialist countries. And then we can ask what exactly is it that makes them comparable, or where do they not compare? And I think some of the points is that this absence of continuity did result in a little bit later institutionalization within the group of successful ones than, for example, Germany, who had it in the 40s. So here in Scandinavian cases and in Yugoslavia, it happened, let's say, later 50s until the 60s. So it's a little bit later. But more interestingly, in these cases, it were always really strong, the state institutions who were the driving forces behind the institutionalization of sociology. And this leads then to something which I think is a stronger heteronomy in relation to the state institution. And this is actually true both of Yugoslavia and of Scandinavia, where welfare state policy research was very dominant in sociology. So the gaining of social recognition for sociologists happened much more in direct relation from state institutions, and not as in the case of those with stronger pre-war conditions by themselves from a more established intellectual tradition. And from there we can also ask, for the Yugoslav case, for example, if we find such an ideological congruence, is this actually a process that is similar to these Scandinavian examples, or is it more something that has been the dominant interpretation of simply being a non-democratic state who works with suppression? And I also have a case study on that, and I think actually that the comparison with Scandinavia is here more relevant than the other. So, basic conclusion after these comparisons, going back to cases and finding new angles is, in my view, the most important lesson that we can learn. And here I stop, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Matthias. It was really interesting, like Christian's. So now I invite Elisa to have the comments, to start commenting both presentations, and then afterwards we open for further questions. Thank you very much. Elisa is coming. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Christian and Matthias, for such inspiring presentations. And thanks, Marcia, for organizing this great session and for giving me the privilege to debate it. I confess that I'm extremely motivated to explore some of the methodological tools and paths of analysis you've shown us today. I prepared some brief comments and questions to foster the debate, mostly on the methodological possibilities when it comes to the integration of different levels of analysis. The slide that Christian displayed at the beginning with the 5 levels of analysis is a good departure point for this conversation. From my own experience with research in the field of history of social science, I reckon that the definition of the level of analysis is a major challenge, considering the degree of entanglement of these multiple dimensions. For instance, when choosing to analyze the patterns of career of scholars or their networks without discussing their ideas, we lack the comprehension of the effects that these types of careers and network structures could have over the production and diffusion of the science itself. When choosing, on the other hand, to build a network of citations and collaborations without knowing the agents engaged in these collaborations or the context that led to these exchanges, it's not easy to find the causal links that would help explain the observed patterns. In this case, my question for you is, how do you address the challenge of integrating these levels and units of analysis in your research? And more generally, what methodological combinations and tool manipulations could be used to integrate several levels of analysis at the same time? For instance, do you, Matthias, have an hypothesis concerning the variation in the characteristics of the social science produced according to the degree of institutionalization and the temporality of the development of the field of sociology in each country? Does it affect directly the content of the social science produced in each one of them? Christian, if working with directional citations, not the co-citations, would it be possible, for instance, instead of coloring the citations exchanges using the clustering method, to use colors and size to indicate seniority of the agents in order to see the directionality of the citations is influenced in any way by the levels of career of the agents? Or to use the degrees of connections in a citation network as a variable of scientific power and dissemination and insert it, for instance, in a multiple correspondence analysis as it was done, for instance, with Social Capital by François Denord. Second, since this debate is having place at the Science in Circulation project, I would also like to ask some questions regarding the focus on the national/international spheres. One challenge in the studies of history of social science is to map not only the displacement of scholars, but also of ideas, concepts, methods, and to detect and understand the speed, path, length of diffusion of these ideas, devices, etc. And to seize if there is a hierarchical power structure of the production and circulation of science. Starting with Christian, I was wondering what could result from the combination between networks of citation and georeferenced coordinates of the authors. I imagine that it would also be possible to time frame a georeferenced network and play it in order to have a video of the process of dissemination of the references, which would lead us to see when each country joins the network and highlight the patterns of their international connection. Matthias, I would like to know more about the relations with the neighboring countries. It was interesting to learn about the effects of inhibition resulting from the presence of a strong neighbor with similar cultural features. I was wondering, nevertheless, what other roles neighboring countries can play, considering either the competition between neighbors to establish very different patterns and scientific models, or the eagerness and easiness when it comes to cooperate. How it would be possible to track and typify the patterns of interactions and exchanges between countries in a specific field. Moreover, how are these neighboring relations affected by the international organizations, scientific foundations, and associations which influence both the establishment of new networks and the concession of resources? I have one more question for each presenter and a final one regarding both. So, Matthias, do you believe that the same approach could be applied to other regions of the globe? Maybe changing Catholic for a variable concerning conservative religious confessions in general, or coding a more general variable for political openness, etc. What would be the major challenges if you were to extend this project to a global set? Christian, when it comes to the data limitations that you mentioned, I got specifically worried about the limitations that the language barrier represents to the analysis, since it blocks, for instance, the mapping of local circuits of knowledge exchange. I'm studying like exchanges in Latin America, between Latin Americans, so that would be completely out of any map of the co-citation analysis if we were taking only terms in English. Are there possible solutions to integrate multiple languages into the same network? Finally, for both of you, thinking about the possibilities of merging approaches, would you guess that there is a correlation between the timing of institutionalization of a national scientific field and the centrality and degree of connectivity of this country in a network of citations. That is, if you put both of your projects together, what would be the outcome? Well, those are my questions. Thank you. And thanks for the invitation, Matthias, again.
Thank you, Elisa. So both of you are invited now to answer. Christian, would you like to start?
I can do so. Thank you very much, Elisa. Very, very wise and challenging questions. I don't feel like I can really tackle upon every issue that you address, but let me just single out a few things. First, every suggestion that I heard with regard to possible options in terms of refining the quantitative analysis presented here, I'm absolutely agree. This would be all these would be wonderful things, and would help to elaborate. This perhaps also relates to one of the, if I may now, one of the questions in the chat, which concerned why
Your microphone, sorry, Christian, something happened. We don't have your voice.
Have you heard anything of what I was saying? Oh, I'm so sorry.
Last 20 seconds. Last 20 seconds.
Okay, last 20 seconds. Okay. I don't know how that happened. Somebody muted me. There is a sabotage going on.
No.
Oh, but
yes, it was me.
No, just
sorry.
Ah, really? Okay. No, that doesn't. So yes, all this is possible. All this is good. All this is all this might lead to wonderful results, provided that, and this takes up one of the other issues that you raised, provided that you spend some time on your data set, right? So, so my idea basically here was to show something which can be done very quickly if you happen to have an access to Web of Science, and you can do that, and you can use these as first step into an analysis, right? I still think that the separation, I would like to emphasize that again, between our understanding, or my understanding, of the units of analysis as only the place where you're researching something more abstract, like circulation, right? So or political influence. So you look at actors or ideas with a specific interest, which is not really only related to the actors, unless, yeah. So and for this, so I think the VOS viewer is a very quick and a good tool. You can do much more, and especially, so I'm experimenting a bit. I'm not too good at that, but of course, so the highest level for me is some form of dynamic display, and a second issue that would be great would be not to use, so to have a mapping onto a real geographical space, right? So to not to have the network analytical program create a space on its own, but map it onto a geographical space, which in fact is a geographical space, a real. So not do their map on their own, but map it on the map, so to speak. Yes, I think in principle, of course, it is possible, and so language is a large limitation, unless you're doing, you're doing International Institute of Applied Systems Analysis, where then it becomes a problem, and you can merge data sets. You need some time to do that, but of course you can add to the 500 titles that you get out from Web of Science. You can add, I don't know, 500 from Portuguese database. Merging, however, and this is, as you certainly know, requires you to work on it to clear the data and to identify duplications which are possible, and this needs some time. And this this moves a thing a bit away from the exploratory character that I wanted to emphasize here. Thank you.
So Matthias, your turn.
Yes, thanks also. These are really very pertinent questions. The first one, are there any effects on the content of sociological knowledge produced stemming from these different configurations? Yes, I think this is really one of the, that's one of the crucial questions. Because only then it really matters what I do here, if there's some degree of difference coming from that. And it is a question for case studies. In the end, I tried to give a few ideas of how this could be done. And in one case, I did it, in the case of Yugoslavia. And here, some of the things, the general view on Yugoslav sociology has been that it's been relatively non-pluralistic and relatively close in ideological terms to what the party state defined as interests, as also theoretical angles. So it's been really very strongly dominated by humanist Marxism. And it's covered all these important questions of worker self-management and the topics that were politically salient at the time. So there is a clear connection. The condition here within my conditions is here. I think the most important that it's been only established at the time. And this is a kind of hypothesis then that allows for further comparisons. Can we look at other countries where it's been established later, and do we find this closeness again in terms of content? And this is exactly the point that I'm trying to make. Maybe this is for the Scandinavian case not as convincing as I think, but I think there is at least some point in it. By consequence, this would mean, and that is an hypothesis, that countries with a stronger continuity should be more pluralistic during the time. Should have less clear focus areas in their research, and that is something that maybe Christian can answer with his tools. I'm not sure exactly, but of course, I think this is really the number one question to ask after such a comparison. How do we see differences in the kind of knowledge that's being produced? Because this is what it's all about, after all. The question with the neighboring country, yes, I also think this needs much more analysis because it's more complicated. I did refer to the difference between one large dominating country and the smaller, as the Scandinavian case, a couple of smaller countries that do foster cooperation much more. But it is, of course, quite likely that also in the larger, smaller relations, there is much more cooperation between these two than between others. So again, here we could ask, do we find a much stronger importation of ideas, of people, of methods and techniques between two countries that share linguistic commonalities? And I would assume this is certainly the case. I didn't prove it. But then again, within this context of these only 20 odd years after 1945, I think the mechanisms through which this really inhibits institutionalization, which is what I'm saying actually, I think this needs to be clarified. And I'm a little bit, let's say, I'm slightly skeptic that this covers the whole story very well. I think we need to look into that more clearly. So I think this is an important point to clarify in future studies. Then the question of expanding this analysis to other contexts. And I think I've thought about this a lot, and it's very complicated. My idea, my feeling is that the kind of geographical scope that I applied to Europe at this specific time is already the maximum that makes sense to compare. Because already here, all of these conditions in the end mean rather different things. So you have to be quite abstract already to bring this into one research design. To go even more abstract than that, probably then at one point loses touch with the actual case studies. So I mean, this is not a principal question in QCA. In principle, you can do 5,000 cases if you want. The formal logic is the same. But I think it works best if you still have sufficient understanding of the cases that you're speaking about. And so I would not really be happy to expand this even more than it already is. Also, I've been asked earlier if the same model could be applied to other disciplines. Already there, it wouldn't be the same. It wouldn't be the same conditions after all. So it is really making sense of a specific historical situation, and I think it's not very useful to expand it overly because conditions are just too different. But well, maybe somebody has good ideas how to do it. But my intuition would be rather go smaller than bigger to be useful. Well, and the question with how to merge these two approaches, I think I answered already before. If there are certain hypotheses that we can deduce for the contents of sociological work, they must be found in citations, for example. So this could be starting points, the things that I said, to verify, do they make sense on that level or not.
Yes, and also, if I may, with regard to another question in the chat, also by Flavia Martins, which would concern exactly what co-citation analysis can in principle deliver, right? So reference points within national literatures, you can do that. We didn't do that. It's again a question of finding the best databases from which to draw your data. But in principle, that would be the path.
Hi, Christian. Sorry, did you finish there? Yes, so thank you very much. Well, I cannot see if there are more questions. At the moment, I have no question here. So I will have questions for you, but very, very fast, just while we, and because also the time is there, no? It's almost 4 o'clock. And so, Christian, I would like to ask you just one question. I did it, what you did, but not only me, but anyway, I had a manual, a handbook from the 20s and the 30s, and I took to 8,000. I don't know, I don't remember now, but the bibliography of this manual of 8 volumes, like 6,000 pages of the whole handbook. But anyway, and I did this these citations per author. And what I would like to ask you, if this method could be applied today to books, or if the book or the books are published in ebook forms. Because to remind you, in Brazil, not everybody who produces or who is producing is publishing in the Web of Science source. So many of our production are made in books, by books. So would it be possible? Because in my case, it's a handbook from the 20s or 30s. So I had to scan the whole 8,000 pages. And so I think it's not possible if we put together this amount of books, but as long as they are published in ebook forms, would be interesting. Another thing is, after that, I had to do a trajectory research, because you have the authors who cited, for example, Freud, or who cited other authors in because it's a handbook of psychology, and so you see exactly who is citing who. And when Freud is coming, a person very cited, and when he's not, and things like that. But after that, you have a group of people citing the same author. So this group is sitting now, stopping citing Bergson and starting citing Freud. And then it's necessary to do, to have a trajectory study. Otherwise, you cannot explain why these people. And then you find, in my case, I found out they have they work in the same university, they had the same faculty, so it's a school of thought, more or less. But after the second research, and for Matthias, it's I'm asking you from the point of view of a study case of Brazil, and even shorter from São Paulo case, not only for Brazil, because Brazil is a continent. So, and I pointed out in an article that it will be published next days. I pointed at exactly the variables that are not here in your research, like the size of the university, if there is schools or faculties of medicine, faculties of engineering, because engineering, social engineers and social physicians or social doctors, they were the first here, sociologists. So in
Matthias,
the first, yes.
Do you speak about me?
Yes.
Sorry, I was disconnected for a while. I didn't hear anything.
No,
so.
okay, I can summarize.
Okay.
It's just that I missed some variables, and I know at the end you said study case will solve the problems. These studies didn't. But anyway, why could you not include a variable like size of the university, of courses of medicine, courses of engineering? Because we know they are the first sociologists. So maybe in Hungary or maybe in Scandinavia, there were no courses of medicine, no courses of engineering. In the first moment in Brazil, in São Paulo, they helped growing demand for sociological research, even if it's not our patterns of sociological research nowadays. But you see, maybe you could amplify, how to say that, make bigger your variables of comparative research with simple data, like in these countries, did they have medical courses, engineering courses, because at the very first moment, these guys are the ones who made sociology possible, because they are acting in market, they are acting in the state, they are doing social research and in quoting. Afterwards, they can be a barrier of a pure sociology, no, because it's a period of heteronomy, not autonomy. And you point out that it's what you say, welfare state policy research. So I think you should. It could be a possibility. So I would like to listen to you about that. Thank you very much. So Christian.
Yeah, thank you, Masha. I'm happy to start. Yes, of course, you can do that with books, and yes, of course, it is very useful to have the ebooks, and the data should be accessible in what form ever. I understand your research interests, but and I share these. I only would want to point out that this, I mean, this extends. So your research interest extends beyond co-citation analysis, right? Because you're, for instance, also interested in bibliographic coupling. So who are the groups who cite the same sources, right?
Exactly.
Not only which sources are cited together. So also interested in who are the guys who cite the same sources. You are interested in a dynamic picture, and you are also, I mean, you're probably also would have to do some other forms of of social network analysis when you want to have both citing authors and cited authors in one network, right? That's what I understood. That's especially interesting, of course, in when you are dealing with contemporary citations. So I cite Matthias and Marcia, and Marcia cites me, right? So in these reciprocities of citing, but then you're directly in a very classical social network analysis using bibliographic data, and not in these subgroups or sub-analysis, sub-forms of analysis like co-citation analysis and bibliographic coupling.
Thank you, Christian. Thank you very much. Matthias?
Yes, thanks. I mean, this is also one of the tough questions, why the conditions that I chose and why not others. There's no formalized way of finding these conditions. So what you do is you read many histories, and then you try to find conditions for which you have an idea that there is on the one hand, the variation within the cases, and the variation that really explains the differences. The one that you mentioned, I think, is really interesting. I simply haven't thought of it, to look for the basis for sociological institutions from other intellectual enterprises. This might very well be. I'm not sure if in this case it would result in something that really falls into two groups more or less nicely, because this is what you're looking after. So you want to have conditions for which you know there are a couple of cases that exhibit it and others that do not, and that there must be sufficient difference between them. And it should be a strong difference. It should be really a qualitative difference. Is something here or is it not here? So I didn't come across the size of universities in medicine and engineering as a factor in the historical case studies that I've read, but it's certainly something I could think about. So that is the substantial answer. There's also a technical problem to it. The 5 conditions is already a lot for mathematical reasons. If I had 6 conditions, I would have the double of possible configurations. I would have 64, and then only 11 actual empirical configurations. So there is in Qca a problem. You shouldn't have too many conditions because you cannot interpret this anymore, because there's too many possible combinations. So that is also a technical limitations, why you should somehow try to stick with those that you feel make a big difference. But the choice of all of these conditions, this is really something that the researcher has to take responsibility and say, this is what I think is interesting. There is really no way of deciding formally or mathematically which one is important and which one is not. It's not like in correlational analysis where you say, okay, one of these variables has an effect, the other does not have an effect. You cannot do this. It's just handmade by your own judgment. It's not testing correlations. It's just looking for formal relations between things that you put into on your own account. That is what it does. But I think this is a very good point that you made. I will think about it. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Matthias. Well, we have now, we passed the time, but I'm not sure. I can see now, I find out that I just found out that there are 2 questions here. I'm not sure if they are already answered. They've been answered. Are they answered? One of them, I'll read it anyway. Can you answer? Did you see that, Christian? The first one, I'm studying politically engaged. This one you answered, isn't it? Or not?
Well, I can quickly do that again. I tried to pick up on both during the discussion. I used VOS Viewer just for the very reason to have something very quick and handy to present. In my other work on social network analysis, I'm even a keen user of UCINet. But also Gephi, as Flavia mentioned, because it just makes beautiful displays. And yes, the second question relates to the more to the traditions of thought. Do you have something to say on that, Matthias?
I mean, it is first and foremost an empirical question, of course, that is a little bit hard to answer now from spontaneously. But every tradition that I came across has, I think, at least a certain degree of consensus over some of the canonic authors for the discipline. So the ones that you mentioned, Durkheim, Weber, Marx, I would suggest in all European sociological traditions they play a major role. At least all that I have been looking at to some degree. But in the same time, I would be rather certain that there are also differences than, let's say, from ranks 4 to 15, who are the most cited classics. So that would be certainly an interesting question.
So there are no more questions. At least I cannot see them here, and I think we need to stop. Otherwise, we will be here for a couple of hours. And so I'd like to thank you a lot, all of you, Christian, Matthias, Elisa. It was really interesting. It was not so hard to understand. I'm much more comfortable now with the after the explanations. And I'd like to thank you also our audience, and to inform the students they can demand their certificate from Unifesp, from the university, or the university, I'm not sure, but I think the university will send it to them. And also that this session is being recorded, and so you will have the opportunity to listen to it afterwards. We will put it in our website, in SciCi-IEAC, in circulation in advanced studies from Unifesp. So thank you very much, everybody, and hope to see you soon in another session next month. So bye-bye. See you.
Thanks very
Thank
much.
you.